have a small Halloween project for you. This would really look nice either standalone or if you have a Halloween village that you're building, and it would certainly work well with Grimsley Village and my series of houses and whatnot. So let's get started. I started by creating a base. I cut out a piece of heavy chipboard in kind of a wavy pattern because I didn't want to see any square edges. And then I went hunting in the yard for some pieces of dead wood and glued those to the back. And then those, not only do they kind of look cool, they also gave me a way to add another one that stands up. And I glued those down first, and then I could glue that down in between each piece of stick, and then that one has that little part that jots out, and that kind of wraps around it. So that was just really good support for the tall stick. The centerpiece of the scene is the cauldron. Now this is just started out as a black plastic cauldron, and the first thing I did is I used a couple of molds that I put some paper clay in, and I used that to decorate the cauldron. And when you do something like this, because the cauldron is curved, the big bat, I actually took it out of the mold while it was still wet and then applied it to the cauldron. I didn't glue it, just wrapped it around, so that way when it dried, it was in that shape. And you just need to keep checking on it as it's drying because it will try to bend back out again. And then, of course, I used the little bats. This little mold here, it has bats and moons and stars and pumpkins and ghosts. And I've used the moons and stars further on down for the witch's hat. And then after I got done with the molds and the clay and applied those onto the cauldron, I used copper gilder's paste to rub with my finger all over. And that kind of brings out the details, and it makes it more interesting than just having it solid black. Now it also had a handle which I removed because I didn't think you needed it. If you were going to put candy in it or something, you would, but for this scene you certainly don't want a big handle. And then now I had to put something inside, and I ended up stuffing it with just some glass pebbles and some sand, and that was just to fill it up, and it also gave it some weight. And that weight helps because I've got the sticks glued on. The weight of the cauldron helps to keep the whole piece in place and not fall over. And then what I wanted to do is I want to kind of give it a gooey, slimy, bubbly kind of look. So I took another piece of paper clay and rolled it out and cut it in a circle. And then to make the bubbles, I used the round end of a pen, a writing pen, and I just pushed it into the clay. So I got it on the tin foil, and that's so that I could hold it in my hand as I was pushing the pin in it. And so that's the underside. So what you're doing is you're creating those bubbles and bumps on the other side. So I let that dry, and if it's too big, it's going to shrink some, but if it's too big to fit into the cauldron, you can just trim it. You can cut it with scissors or sand it. And so I stuffed that in the top of the cauldron, and then I painted everything first with a dark green, and then I came back in after that dried and used a little bit lighter green. And then the final step is I used kind of a metallic shiny green so that it gave it a little bit more of a slimy look. And then you see that the finished product of the bubbling goo that's inside the cauldron. I thought it would be cool to set the cauldron on top of something. And so what it's sitting on is a pile of bones. And what I did, again, I took paper clay and I used a mold that you buy in the craft store for making candy. And the bones were pretty small, so it was a perfect size. And also with that, the one side is flat, so it made it easy to stack. So I just made a lot of bones out of paper clay. And then you can see here, I glued them together in a square. And I had a series of squares, which I stacked on top of each other. And I just turned it at an angle. So each one was at a different angle as I piled it up. Now to color it, I first started out by painting it this kind of taupe color, and the paint here in the picture is wet, so that's why it's so glossy. So once it dried, then I took some brown paint and I really, I thinned it out and just kind of took a brush and just kind of let it run all over the bones. And that way you get a little bit more dimension that you wouldn't have if you just did the one color of paint. And if you just paint it with brown, then it's just too heavy and you don't see that taupe color underneath. So that's how I came about making that. And then of course the cauldron sits on top of that. Now the witch's hat is made from polymer clay. And the way I did this is I first rolled out a piece and then cut it into a circle. And then I took another piece of clay and shaped it into a cone and then rolled it out so that the cone got skinnier and skinnier and skinnier till it got to more of a pointed end. And then I stuck that on top of the circle and then twisted that end so it had kind of a crazy shape to it. Then I baked it. And if you want to get that kind of bubbly look that I've got going on there, bake it too long. It'll start bubbling up. So if you bake it too long, too hot, that's what polymer clay does. And so that it'll give you that really kind of bubbly look, which I liked it because it just kind of gave it more interest than just a smooth hat. And I thought it looked more distressed that way too. And then I just painted it black. And the last thing I did is the mold that you saw earlier that had all those little bitty things in it where I already used some of the bats. I painted some of the stars and the moons, the stars gold and the moon silver, and I put those on the hat to decorate it. On the left-hand side of the scene, you see a pile of books. There's a stack, and then there's one sitting that's opened, and then one that's sitting in front. And all those come from a new collage sheet of mine. And here you can see what it looks like. If you have some of my older collage sheets like this, they're scaled much bigger. So this is all, I took some of my older images and scaled them down so that they would fit a miniature project like this. So you get several books. And then I also scaled down a bunch of the potions and spells that I'd written. And so those are the pages that you see with the open book. And then in addition, I added some miniature little potion labels that can go on bottles. So I've used several of those books. All I did was cut everything out. And then for the books themselves that weren't going to be open, I just filled those with either heavy chipboard just to make it, or not heavy chipboard, thin chipboard, just to make it faster to fill them. And then some of them are just filled with squares of cardstock. So that's basically how I put those together. And then of course you want to distress them, and I use some vintage photo distress ink just to make everything look really rustic, all the edges of the paper and the edges of the book. Now what you'll also see are potion bottles at different places around the scene. You can see here there's 3 bottles on the left hand side in front of the witch's hat. And I'll give you a few tips on distressing them. I just took glass bottles, I filled them with some stuff, I used the labels on the front, and then I dripped wax on top of them, and that's how you see all that stuff just kind of oozing down off the bottles. And then what I do is I light the top of the cork on fire, and it will catch anyway if you get your candle too close to it. But blow it out right away, and it'll give you that burned, really distressed look on the cork itself. Some final things to dress up the scene. You can see that I have a broom that's leaning on the tree. You see there's an owl sitting above, and that's actually one of my images from one of my collage sheets. And then there's a spider. It's kind of dark there because the spider's black, but a spider is hanging from a wire on the left-hand side of the tree. And then I've added some moss. And what I did is I didn't want the moss to be too thick, so I basically just used my fingers to just separate it and just pull it completely apart before I added it to the scene. And then I've got these little seed pods, and these pods, they look just like pumpkins, but they're some kind of a seed. And so I've got those sprinkled all around. That's it for the Witch in the Woods. I hope you like that, and that I've given you some tips and tricks that you could use in your own Halloween scenes, or if you want to do something like this. Down in the description area will be a link to my blog, which will have information on the new collage sheet and also other supplies that I used for this project. In addition, there'll be a link to more pictures.